This is the way a master mason does the same thing. Now here you'll notice the feet are at right angles to each other, the heels touching together. And this is the way a master mason would stand and approach the altar. And again, the same thing applies. If this person were to go into a court or even like a job interview perhaps and want to let people know that he was a mason, he might stand this way and not have to say a word. It's interesting, though, that Proverbs chapter 6 and 12 says this: "A naughty person, a wicked man, walketh with a froward mouth. He winketh with his eyes, he speaketh with his feet, he teacheth with his fingers." Just what we're talking about here. And people say the Word of God isn't inspired. Okay. Now, let's talk about the good old boy network. Let's talk about the craft and business. Masonry has been around a long time, and it has been used as a way to get ahead in business for a long time. Masonry began with the stonemason guild, and it may surprise you to learn that it was just like, for example, say the carpenters union that we have today, or the plumbers union, or even the stonemasons union, except for one difference. Back in the Middle Ages, nobody could read. So, for example, if you showed up on a job site and the foreman said, "Are you a master mason?" and you whipped out your card and showed it to him, he couldn't read it. That's a problem. So how do you let someone know that you're a master mason if they can't read? Well, the answer is simple. You walk into the job site, you say, "I'm a master mason." You can either use some of these little handshakes, or you can simply do this. You go like this, and the guy knows you're a master mason. And that's all there is to it. You got the job. Just as good as a dues card. Now here's another question. It's more contemporary. Let's say your boss is a mason. Let's say that you're up for a promotion and the guy that's competing with you for that promotion is a Freemason. Who do you think is going to get that job? I'll give you a clue. It ain't going to be you. Another thing that Masons do is they use the lodge to network. And this is especially the case with doctors and lawyers. Because doctors and lawyers, it used to be, their codes of ethics would not allow them to advertise. I know all of you are probably sick of seeing commercials for lawyers now. But, you know, back in my day, when I was, say, maybe 20, 25 years old, lawyers were not allowed to advertise. And so the only way they could advertise was through the lodge or through similar fraternal organizations. They would develop networks, and that's how they would get referrals. So then we have the whole thing of discounts. I've already alluded to that, for example, you can walk into a store, and if you're a Mason, you say certain little funny words, and they'll give you a discount. And then, of course, the question becomes, how many large corporations are being run today by Masons? Many, many of them. Just one example. How many of you know that Dave Thomas, the guy that owns Wendy's, he's a 33rd degree Mason? Might want to rethink where you buy your hamburgers. Anyway, and it's a shame because I always kind of like that guy. Anyhow, then we've got the lodge and the law. This is even getting more sinister here, folks. Because of what I just mentioned, this whole issue of how lawyers used to build clients, there's always been a close association between the lodge and the law. Large numbers of lawyers and judges are Masons. In fact, in the old days, almost all lawyers were Masons. That's a little bit less true today, but and especially obviously if you're a female lawyer, you're not a Mason. But many judges and many lawyers are Masons. Additionally, throughout Europe and America, a disproportionate number of law enforcement people are Masons. In London, it was essentially required that one be a Mason to advance in Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan Police. Untold hundreds of sheriffs in this country and police chiefs are Masons. J. Edgar Hoover, for example, was a 33rd degree Mason. This left a solid Masonic stamp on the FBI, which persists to this day. Now, all of this sounds only vaguely disturbing, but for one thing, and that is the content of the oaths that are given in Masonry. For example, When you take the third-degree oath of a Master Mason, one of the codicils in that oath says that you will warn a brother Master Mason of approaching danger so that he can get out of the way. Now let's say you're in the prosecuting attorney's office, or let's say you're a police officer, and you learn that a brother Master Mason is going to have a warrant served on him for his arrest. You're obligated by an oath to go and warn that Mason so he can skip town before he's thrown in the clink. Another thing is that you will notice in the third-degree oath that you swear that you will keep the secrets of a Master Mason inviolate within your heart, murder and treason excepted. That means any crime except murder and treason, you are obligated by that blood oath to cover. If he's a rapist, if he's a child molester, if he's a thief, if he's an arsonist, any of that stuff, you have to conceal that. You are not allowed to talk about that. And that's true even if you're an officer of the court. Now it gets even worse. Let's say you're a 7th degree Royal Arch Mason in New York Rite. Then the oath is that you have to keep the secrets of a Royal Arch companion inviolate within your heart, murder and treason not accepted. In other words, you've got to keep everything secret. That guy could be an axe murderer. He could be a traitor to the United States like the esteemed Mason Benedict Arnold was. And the Masons would not be able to reveal that. This is pretty serious stuff. Now, let me give you a couple of examples of this. In many communities, especially in the South, try to bring a case against a Mason. You will not get very far, even in the so-called Bible Belt. True story, the boys and the juvenile court judge. There was a juvenile court judge in the Pacific Northwest who had a predilection for little boys. And basically, he presided over a lot of these juvenile delinquent type hearings, and many times, if he liked the boy would get off in exchange for meeting with the judge in chambers and exchanging certain favors, shall we say. Well, this fellow, they kept trying to bust him, and because he was surrounded by Masons, both in the courts and in the law enforcement, they would always cover up for him. Finally, one of the boys went and tattled to the newspaper, and fortunately, the fellow who was the reporter was not a Mason. The story got out. The fellow apparently killed himself, but broken rocks were found in his pocket. Talk more about those broken rocks later. Another true story. There was a financial scam artist in London, and basically he was bilking all sorts of people out of money. And there was a Scotland Yard officer who was trying to nail this guy, and they couldn't get him, and they couldn't get him because the Masons in the yard and the Masons that were surrounding him were protecting him. Finally, the guy did manage to find enough evidence to convict the fellow, but guess what happened to the Scotland Yard official? He was almost busted the meter maid. And they kept giving him the worst possible assignments, and finally the fellow actually had to resign. Then there's the case of the woman who was married to a Shriner. It was his second marriage. He was considerably older than she. She was a young, attractive woman. And he was a member of a very elite shrine organization called the Jesters. Now, if you know anybody who's a jester, be afraid. These are very creepy people. And what would happen in this particular woman's case, and I know it's not isolated because of some of the documents I have seen, every Friday night they would have poker. And he would tie his wife up on the bed, and all the other jesters would rape her. And there was nothing she could do about it. She went to the local police chief, and he was a Shriner. She went to the district attorney, and he was a Shriner. And finally, she was about to go higher than that, and a psychiatrist came to her and said, if you say one more word, we're going to have you locked up as a paranoid delusional because I'm also a Mason. And you'll be locked up forever on my signature, and you'll never get out. She ended up having to flee the state. These are examples of how Masons can cause a miscarriage of justice. But here is probably the most celebrated example of this in the history of the West. Jack the Ripper, a Freemason? The answer to that question is yes, one way or another. Let me explain. For those of you that may not know, Jack the Ripper is probably the Western world's first known serial killer. He murdered 8 prostitutes in Whitechapel district of London in the year 1888, and he had the whole city of London terrified. This was Victorian England, mind you, and nothing like this had ever happened in the history of England that anybody knew of. And here's what happened. They mounted a huge investigation. The man in charge of the investigation was Police Commissioner Warren, who was a Freemason. At that time, the Prime Minister of England, as is often the case, was a Freemason. The heir presumptive to the throne of England, the Duke of Clarence, was also a Mason. And the physician to the royal court at the time, Dr. Gull, was a Freemason. Now, here's what actually happened. The 8 women who were killed, if you study this, and I happen to have been, before I even became a Mason, I was kind of a Jack the Ripper buff. I'd read several of the books about him and kind of studied up. And when I became a Mason, I realized that the horrible way these unfortunate women were murdered was in accord with Masonic ritual gestures. Just one of them had her throat cut from ear to ear, another one had her bowels ripped out of her body and thrown over her left shoulder, and so on and so on. These were Masonic ritual murders. But why? Well, here's what happened. Believe it or not, the Duke of Clarence, who was second in line to the throne of England, had fallen in love with a prostitute named Annie Crooks. And he married this woman. Now that was bad enough, but he had a child by her, a little girl. And this woman, horror of horrors, was a Roman Catholic. Now, if you understand the way the Parliament and the monarchy work in England, there is a law that no member of the royal family can ever marry a Roman Catholic because of the adversarial relationship that existed for centuries between the Church of Rome and the Church of England. And so this would have shaken the very foundations of the throne of England. So Dr. Gull, who was a physician and surgeon, had Annie Crooks committed to a mental institution where she died by suicide several months later, because of course in those days mental hospitals were not really Club Med, not that they are today either. The little girl, who was 2 or 3 at most, was placed in a Catholic orphanage. But every woman in Whitechapel, from Catherine Beddoes to Mary Jane Kelly, that knew of the wedding and knew Annie Crooks, were horribly murdered to conceal the secrets of a brother Master Mason. Now, you'll notice the thing up there on the board. It says, the Jewes will not be blamed for nothing. Now, you might wonder, what the heck does that mean? Well, this phrase was scrawled on an alley in Whitechapel during the height of the hysteria. What does that phrase mean? Well, believe it or not, Police Commissioner Warren ordered it immediately struck from the alley. It was taken off the alley, erased. He claimed it was because he did not want to have anti-Semitic riots, because he was afraid people would believe the Jews were out there killing prostitutes. Actually, that was a lie. This term, Jewes, is actually a Masonic code word. It refers to the 3 ruffians who murdered Hiram Abiff, Jubilo, Jubilah, and Jubilum. And this was a kind of roundabout way of saying the Masons will not be blamed for nothing. Now, if you want any further proof of this, I would direct your attention to what Jack the Ripper originally called himself, because he wrote letters describing his atrocities. And obviously, whether it was Dr. Gull or whether it was an accomplice who worked with Dr. Gull, we don't know. But we do know this. Many people have remarked that the killings themselves were obviously done by someone who was a surgeon. The cuts were done very, very carefully and with an extremely profound knowledge of human anatomy. Anyway, the first time, before Jack was called Saucy Jack or Jack the Ripper, the first nickname he gave himself was Leather Apron. Now, every Mason, when they are made a Master Mason, is given a white lambskin or leather apron. That is the badge of a Mason. Now, this illustrates how Masonry can be used, and is often used, to conceal crimes, even for a century. Now, let's move on. We'll talk now about the craft and politics, everybody's favorite subject.